The pain had stopped feeling like pain 3 days ago. Now it was architecture, rigid geometry spreading through Vess Tallin's exoskeleton, transforming her body into something that resembled a monument more than a living thing. She could still move her primary arms, barely, and her head retained enough articulation to track movement across the medical bay's observation windows. Everything else had begun the slow surrender to ossification. She had stopped counting the medical scans, stopped reading the reports that arrived in her chamber's data terminal with decreasing frequency. The hegemony's xenobiologists had exhausted their vocabulary of failure. What remained was waiting, and the particular quality of silence that accompanied someone the universe had decided to discard. Vess had been a strategic operations commander for the 7th Diplomatic Corps. She had coordinated fleet movements across contested borders, had made calculations that balanced resource allocation against acceptable casualty rates, had signed orders that ended planetary governments and restructured trade routes. Her decisions had been clean, precise, unencumbered by sentiment. Now she couldn't lift her secondary arms without her vision whiting out. The quarantine chamber was comfortable in the way spaces designed for the dying always were, temperature-controlled, acoustically muted, equipped with every medical monitoring system the hegemony could install. The observation windows looked out onto the medical bay's central corridor, where staff moved with the brisk efficiency of people who had learned not to make eye contact with terminal cases. Vess watched them and felt nothing. The calcification had stolen more than mobility. It had taken the anger she thought she'd feel, the fear that should have accompanied dissolution. What remained was a strange, detached curiosity about how much of her would remain conscious when the ossification reached her neural clusters. The human arrived on the 19th day of her confinement. She noticed him because he moved wrong, not with the purposeful stride of medical personnel, but with a loose, economical gait that suggested someone conserving energy over long distances. He stopped outside her observation window, close enough that she could see the details the initial briefing hadn't conveyed, the way his hair had started to silver asymmetrically, darker on the left, the small scar bisecting his right eyebrow, the specific exhaustion in his eyes that came from watching bodies fail in ways medicine couldn't prevent. He looked at her the way she had once looked at damaged ships in salvage yards, assessing structural integrity, calculating what could be saved versus what should be abandoned to the void. Elias Cade, xenoimmunologist, civilian contractor, one of 17 humans in the known galaxy who carried immunity markers so rare the hegemony had classified them as strategic biological assets. Her last chance, delivered in a package that didn't look particularly interested in saving her. He studied her through the glass for 47 seconds. She counted because counting was something she could still do, then turned and walked away without acknowledgement. Vess felt her breathing chambers contract in something that might have been disappointment or might have been relief. Elias returned 6 hours later with a medical tablet and the same expression of detached evaluation. This time he entered the chamber's communication vestibule, the intercom activating with a soft click that made Vess's auditory receptors contract reflexively. "Commander Tallin." His voice came through slightly distorted, flattened by the audio compression. "I've reviewed your scans. The calcification originated in your skeletal analog system following exposure to terrestrial microorganisms during atmospheric sampling on Earth. Class 9 contamination protocols failed to account for fungal spore integration at the cellular level." Vess managed the clicking rasp her species used for affirmation. Speaking required muscle contractions that sent fire through ossifying joints. "You're the 47th case I've been asked to evaluate," Elias continued, and there was something in the precision of that number that felt deliberate. 47th individual whose biology has failed to integrate with Earth-origin pathogens. The hegemony sent your file with the same request they always send: save her if possible, document the failure if not. He looked up from the tablet, meeting her eyes through the layers of quarantine glass. "They didn't tell you I've refused 19 of those requests." Vess had read the psychological profiles, had studied the ethical debates that raged through hegemony medical councils about whether his refusals constituted murder or legitimate exercise of bodily autonomy. She had dismissed those debates as theoretical exercises, the kind of abstraction people engaged in when they weren't the ones calcifying from the inside. Now she understood they were instructions for how to beg. "Can you save me?" The words came out broken, each syllable requiring negotiation with joints that wanted to lock permanently. Elias was quiet for a long moment, his gaze tracking across her immobilized form with clinical precision. Physically? Yes. The treatment protocol exists. I've successfully synthesized adaptive antibodies for 12 similar cases. The process takes 4 to 5 months of continuous proximity therapy, during which your immune system learns to tolerate the antibody integration, while my system continues producing targeted responses to your specific pathogen load. He paused, and something shifted in his expression, not quite emotion, but a crack in the professional detachment. But there's a cost. There's always a cost. I can pay. Not that kind of cost. He cut her off, voice flat. The hegemony already transferred compensation. I'm talking about what it will require from you, from both of us. He moved closer to the observation window, close enough that Vess could see the fine lines around his eyes, the particular weariness of someone who had made this explanation too many times. The treatment requires sustained dermal contact, daily monitoring, physical access to areas of active infection that your species considers private, vulnerable. You'll have to trust me with your body in ways that will feel invasive. You'll be completely dependent on my presence, my cooperation, my continued willingness to show up every day for months. Vess felt something tighten in her thorax that wasn't related to the calcification. And if you decide to leave? The question emerged quieter than she'd intended. Then you die. Faster than if we'd never started. The interrupted synthesis creates rejection cascades that accelerate the ossification process. The efficiency of it was almost elegant. A dependency so complete it became indistinguishable from captivity. I need time to think, Vess said, though they both knew she had already made the choice. The dying didn't have the luxury of pride. Elias nodded once, a gesture so economical it barely qualified as movement. You have until tomorrow. After that, the calcification reaches your respiratory system, and even I won't be able to help you. He left without waiting for acknowledgement, and Vess was alone again with the sound of her failing body and a choice that wasn't really a choice at all. They brought him into her chamber the next morning, suited in biosafety equipment that made him look like something medical rather than human. The protocols required 3 separate decontamination cycles, 2 witness attendants, and signed documentation absolving the hegemony of responsibility for any complications arising from interspecies contact. Vess had signed everything, had opened her medical records completely, had agreed to terms that would have been unthinkable 19 days ago when she still believed her body belonged entirely to her. Elias knelt beside her examination platform, with movements that suggested he'd performed this ritual many times before. His gloved hands hovered over the seam where her thorax plating had begun to fuse, the calcification visible as pale striations against her darker carapace. I'll need you to open this section. His voice came through the suit's external speaker, mechanized and distant. Just enough for dermal contact with the infected tissue. The physical act of compliance required triggering muscle groups that had been immobilized for days. Vess felt something tear, not badly, but enough to know she was causing damage her body might not repair. The plates separated with resistance that sent tremors through her entire frame. Beneath the armored exterior lay the soft, vulnerable tissue her species instinctively protected. Pale and unexposed, networked with the bioluminescent patterns that served as secondary communication among her people. She had never shown this part of herself to anyone outside her genetic cohort. Elias's gloved hand made contact with her inner thorax, and Vess's breathing chambers seized involuntarily. The warmth was unexpected. Even through the biosafety barrier, she could feel the heat of his circulation. The steady pulse of his cardiovascular system transmitted through the contact point. His fingers moved with careful precision, tracing the boundary where healthy tissue met infection, mapping the spread of calcification through sensation alone. I can feel where it's advancing, he said quietly, and his voice had lost some of its clinical distance. The spores have integrated into your cellular matrix. They're using your own calcium regulation system against you. His hand pressed slightly harder, not painfully but with enough pressure that Vess became acutely aware of how much access she had granted. He could hurt her easily from this position, could cause damage that would end her before the disease did, Instead, his touch remained methodical, almost gentle, and that gentleness felt more dangerous than cruelty would have. "So you have maybe 3 weeks before this reaches your respiratory chambers," Elias continued, his palm still warm against her exposed tissue. "After that, suffocation. Not fast, not easy." Vess made the clicking sound that served as acknowledgement, unable to produce actual words while his hand remained in contact with nerve clusters that hadn't been stimulated in years. "If I do this," he said, and there was something in his tone that made her auditory receptors focus completely, "you'll be dependent on me, entirely. I'll need to monitor the synthesis daily, sometimes multiple times per day. You'll have to give me access like this." His fingers traced a slow path along the infection's edge, or more, depending on where the treatment needs to concentrate. He paused, and his hand went still against her skin, warm and present and undeniable. The line between medical necessity and something else, it gets blurry in proximity therapy. You need to understand that before we start. Vess understood what he wasn't saying, that 4 months of daily physical contact would create intimacy neither of them had consented to, that her body would learn to expect his touch, to respond to his presence in ways that had nothing to do with medicine, that dependency and desire were separated by distances measured in heartbeats. "Why do you do this?" she managed, her voice barely functional. "Why do you keep agreeing when you could refuse?" Elias's expression remained hidden behind the biosafety visor, but his hand slipped away from her skin, leaving cold absence where warmth had been. "Because someone has to," he said, standing slowly with the careful movements of someone whose body carried its own history of damage. "And because the alternative is watching you calcify alone." He moved toward the chamber exit, but stopped before the decontamination cycle, looking back at her exposed, vulnerable form. "Tomorrow, we start the actual treatment. Get used to this feeling, Commander. It's going to be your reality for the next 4 months." The door sealed behind him, and Vess was left with the ghost sensation of his touch and the understanding that she had just agreed to something far more invasive than medicine. The treatment began with blood work. Elias arrived at 600 station time, carrying equipment that looked more like torture implements than medical instruments. He moved through the chamber setup with practiced efficiency, establishing the biosafety protocols that would govern their interactions for the duration of treatment. "I'll need samples from 3 sites," he explained, laying out collection vials with the careful precision of someone performing a ritual. "Hemolymph from your primary circulation, synovial fluid from the affected joints, and tissue samples from the calcification boundary." He paused, meeting her eyes through the quarantine glass. "The tissue extraction is going to hurt. A lot. I can't use analgesics because they interfere with the antibody synthesis. You'll have to stay conscious and still while I work." Vess had endured pain before, had survived combat injuries, had pushed through system failures that should have been fatal, but those had been acute traumas with defined endpoints. This was different, a deliberate wounding she had to permit, performed by hands she was learning to recognize by touch alone. The extraction took 43 minutes. Elias worked with meticulous care, his movements economical and precise, even when Vess's body tried to contract away from the pain. He spoke constantly during the procedure, a low narrative of what he was doing and why, and she found herself focusing on his voice rather than the sensation of her own tissue being removed in careful increments. "The calcification has infiltrated deeper than the scans indicated," he said, his hands steady despite the resistance her body offered. "I'll need to increase the initial antibody concentration. That means more frequent contact sessions, twice daily for the first 2 weeks. His fingers pressed against newly exposed tissue, checking for infection response, and Vess felt her breathing chambers stutter at the contact. "Your body will start to anticipate my presence," he continued, seemingly unaware of her reaction. "It's a normal part of proximity therapy. Your immune system begins to recognize my biochemical markers as a sign that treatment is incoming. You'll notice increased circulation when I enter the chamber, elevated respiratory rate, heightened sensitivity in the contact zones." He looked up, his expression neutral behind the biosafety equipment. "It's a physiological response. It doesn't mean anything except that the treatment is working." But Vess could already feel what he was describing, the way her system had begun to orient toward him, tracking his movements across the chamber with involuntary precision. Her body learning to expect his touch before her conscious mind registered his proximity. The blood work took another 20 minutes, Elias extracting samples with the same careful efficiency. He labeled each vial with alphanumeric codes she didn't recognize, organizing them in a thermal case designed for biological transport. "I'll process these in the main lab," he said, sealing the case with decisive clicks. "The initial synthesis takes approximately 8 hours. I'll return tonight for the first treatment application." He moved toward the decontamination exit, then paused, looking back at her with an expression she was starting to recognize as concern wrapped in professional distance. "Try to rest. The actual treatment process is significantly more invasive than the sampling." Elias returned at 2200 hours, carrying a medical case and an expression that suggested the synthesis hadn't gone as planned. He entered the chamber without preamble, setting up equipment with movements that had lost some of their earlier precision. "There's a complication," he said, not quite meeting her eyes. "Your immune system is more reactive than anticipated. The standard antibody introduction protocol will trigger rejection cascades unless I can establish sustained biochemical presence first." Vess felt her thorax tighten. Meaning I need to stay in direct contact with you during the initial treatment phase, skin to skin, for approximately 4 hours. My system produces the antibodies continuously. If I maintain contact long enough, your body should begin accepting them as benign rather than foreign. He was still avoiding her gaze, his hands arranging medical supplies with unnecessary precision. "It's going to be uncomfortable, for both of us. But it's the only way to prevent rejection." Vess understood what he was asking. 4 hours of sustained physical contact, their bodies pressed close enough for continuous dermal exchange, an intimacy that exceeded anything medical necessity should require. "When?" she asked. Because the alternative was refusal, and refusal meant death. "Now." Elias finally looked at her, and there was something in his expression that might have been apology or might have been resignation. "The synthesis is only stable for 6 hours. After that, I'll have to start over." He began removing the outer layers of biosafety equipment, keeping only the minimal barrier required to prevent cross-contamination. When he knelt beside her platform this time, she could see the details the suit had obscured, the way his hands showed old scars, the particular tension in his shoulders that suggested chronic pain managed but never resolved. "I'll need you to open your thorax completely," he said quietly, "and I need to position myself close enough for sustained contact. It's going to feel invasive," Vess finished. "You said." "Yes." She triggered the muscle contractions that separated her plating, exposing the vulnerable tissue beneath despite every instinct that screamed violation. Elias moved closer, settling his weight against the examination platform's edge, and then his hand was against her inner thorax, warm and solid and terrifyingly gentle. "I'm going to apply the antibody solution to the primary infection sites," he said, his voice low enough that she felt the vibration through the contact point. "It needs to absorb slowly. I have to maintain pressure and warmth for the entire treatment period." His other hand joined the first, both palms pressed flat against tissue that had never been touched by anyone outside her genetic family. Vess felt her entire system respond, circulation increasing, bioluminescent patterns flaring involuntarily, breathing chambers working harder to process the sudden oxygen demand her body decided it needed. "That's normal," Elias said, and she realized he could feel her physiological response through his hands. "Your system is recognizing mine as a potential threat. The elevated response will decrease as treatment continues." But it didn't decrease. 4 hours of sustained contact, his hands steady against her skin, his breathing synchronized with hers, because they were close enough that she could feel the rise and fall of his chest against her frame. 4 hours of her body learning his warmth, his rhythm, the specific pressure of his palms in ways that felt less like medicine and more like memory formation. He didn't speak much during the treatment, occasionally checked the antibody absorption rate, adjusted his hand position slightly when circulation patterns shifted. Mostly he just maintained the contact, patient and present, while Vess's body catalogued every detail of his proximity. When he finally pulled away, the absence felt like amputation. "Tomorrow morning," he said, his voice rough in ways it hadn't been 4 hours earlier. "Same protocol. It gets easier." He was lying. They both knew it. But Vess nodded anyway, watching him leave with the understanding that she had just crossed a boundary that couldn't be uncrossed. Her body still felt the ghost impression of his hands, warm and steady, long after the chamber door sealed shut. The treatment fell into rhythm. Twice daily, Elias arrived with his medical case and his careful hands. Twice daily, Vess opened her thorax and allowed him access to tissue that felt more exposed each time, her body's protective instincts wearing down under the necessity of repeated contact. The calcification was responding, slowly, grudgingly, but responding. She could extend her secondary arms 3 centimeters further than she'd managed in weeks. The pain had decreased from constant agony to a manageable ache that only flared during movement. But the physical improvement came with complications nobody had warned her about. Her body had begun to anticipate Elias's arrival with embarrassing precision. 20 minutes before each scheduled treatment, her circulation would increase, bioluminescent patterns brightening involuntarily. Her breathing chambers would start working harder, processing oxygen she didn't need for anything except the anxiety of expectation. And when he entered the chamber, when his hands made contact with her inner thorax, her entire system would respond with an intensity that had nothing to do with antibody synthesis. "You're developing treatment dependency faster than expected," Elias noted on the 7th day, his palms pressed against her exposed tissue with the familiar steady pressure. "Your biochemical markers show elevated bonding hormones. That's normal for proximity therapy, but the rate is unusual." His voice remained clinically detached, but Vess could feel the tension in his hands, the way he held himself slightly more carefully, maintained professional distance even while touching her in ways that felt anything but professional. "Is it a problem?" she managed, trying to ignore the way her system surged at his proximity. "Not medically." He adjusted his hand position, fingers spreading to cover more surface area. "But it makes the eventual separation more difficult. Your body is learning to associate my presence with survival. When treatment ends, you'll experience withdrawal symptoms, anxiety, elevated stress hormones, sleep disruption." He paused, and his thumbs moved in small circles against her skin, whether consciously or not, she couldn't determine. "It passes." Eventually, Vess wondered if he was speaking from experience, if the 19 cases he'd refused had included situations where dependency became something neither party could safely navigate. The treatment sessions had started to blur together, each one identical in protocol but subtly different in execution. She was learning to read Elias through touch alone, could tell when he was tired by the way his hands trembled slightly, could sense frustration in the increased pressure of his palms, could feel something that might have been loneliness in the way he sometimes maintained contact seconds longer than medically necessary. They didn't speak much during treatments anymore. Words felt superfluous when communication happened through skin and pressure, and the synchronized rhythm of their breathing. But afterward, in the hours between sessions when Vess was alone in her chamber, she found herself replaying each contact point, cataloging the specific warmth of his hands, the calluses on his palms, the way his pulse felt against her bioluminescent patterns. She was developing dependency, not just biological, something deeper, more dangerous, something that felt disturbingly like need. On the 14th day, Elias arrived 6 hours late. Vess had been tracking time with increasing anxiety, her system cycling through stress responses that made the calcification pain flare in joints that had finally started to heal. When he finally entered the chamber, he moved with the stiff precision of someone managing exhaustion through sheer will. "There was an incident in the medical bay," he said, setting up equipment with hands that shook slightly. "Another case, Krell patient, respiratory collapse." He didn't elaborate, but Vess could see the weight of it in his shoulders, the specific exhaustion that came from watching someone die despite everything you knew how to do. "Did they—" "Yes." The word came out flat. "Before I could synthesize the treatment protocol." Elias knelt beside her platform, but didn't initiate contact immediately. Instead, he sat there, hands resting on his thighs, staring at nothing with eyes that had gone distant. Vess had commanded personnel through enough losses to recognize trauma response. She also knew the professional protocols for offering support: measured distance, respect for emotional processing, avoidance of platitudes. Instead, she found herself extending her primary arm in a gesture her species used for comfort, her hand coming to rest against his shoulder with pressure that felt inadequate and necessary simultaneously. Elias looked at her touch, then at her face, something shifting in his expression. "You don't have to." "I know," Vess said quietly. They stayed like that for several minutes, her hand on his shoulder, his breathing gradually steadying. It was the first time she'd initiated physical contact, the first time she'd offered rather than received, and the reversal felt significant in ways she didn't have language to articulate. When Elias finally moved to begin treatment, his hands were steadier. He opened her thorax with the careful precision she'd come to expect, but when he made contact with her inner tissue, something was different. His touch carried less clinical detachment, more acknowledgement of the intimacy they'd been carefully ignoring. "Thank you," he said quietly, his palms warm against her skin. "For that." Vess didn't answer, didn't need to. The steady rhythm of her bioluminescent patterns communicated what words couldn't. The treatment that evening lasted longer than usual, not because of medical complications, but because neither of them seemed inclined to break contact. They stayed pressed close in the dim chamber light, his hands against her thorax, her system responding with the elevated circulation that had become familiar, and something unspoken shifting in the space between necessity and choice. When he finally pulled away, Elias's expression held conflict, she recognized, the same tension between professional boundaries and something more complicated that Vess felt every time he touched her. "I should go," he said, but he didn't move immediately. "You could stay." The words escaped before Vess could evaluate whether speaking them was wise. "Not for treatment, just stay." Elias looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "That wouldn't be appropriate," he said finally, but his voice carried no conviction. "Nothing about this is appropriate," Vess countered. "You touch me twice daily in ways my species reserves for genetic bonding. You've had access to parts of my body I've never shown anyone outside my cohort. We passed appropriate weeks ago." He didn't argue, didn't agree either, just stood there, caught in the same impossible tension Vess felt, the understanding that they'd already crossed boundaries that couldn't be uncrossed, that every day of treatment brought them closer in ways that had nothing to do with antibody synthesis. "I'll see you tomorrow," he said finally, moving toward the chamber exit with deliberate steps. But he looked back before leaving, his gaze holding hers for seconds that stretched into significance. "Get some rest, Commander." After he left, Vess lay in the darkness of her chamber, her thorax still open, feeling the ghost impression of his hands and wondering when dependency had transformed into something that felt dangerously like longing. The calcification was in full retreat. Vess could move all four arms with minimal pain, could articulate her joints through their complete range of motion, could feel her exoskeleton regaining the flexibility that disease had stolen. The medical scans showed dramatic improvement, ossification reversed in 70% of affected tissue, infection markers decreasing steadily. She was healing, and healing meant the treatments would end soon. The thought created anxiety that had nothing to do with medical concerns. Vess found herself dreading the day Elias would pronounce her cured, would pack his equipment and walk away, would remove the structured necessity that brought him into her chamber twice daily. She wasn't ready to lose the warmth of his hands. The steady rhythm of his breathing synchronized with hers, the specific quality of presence he brought to the space between them. Elias had noticed the improvement too, had started discussing discharge protocols, timeline projections, post-treatment monitoring schedules. His voice remained professionally neutral during these discussions, but Vess could feel the tension in his hands during contact, the way he held himself more carefully now, as if aware that each treatment brought them closer to separation. "Another 3 weeks," he said during the evening session, his palms pressed against her inner thorax with familiar pressure. 4 at most. "Your immune system has fully integrated the antibody synthesis. You'll be able to maintain tolerance independently after that." His thumbs moved in small circles against her skin, a gesture that had become habitual during treatments, whether he was conscious of it or not. "You won't need me anymore." The words hung in the filtered air between them, carrying weight beyond their medical meaning. "What if I want to need you anyway?" Vess asked quietly. Elias's hands went still against her skin. "Commander, Vess." She'd never offered her personal designation before. "My name is Vess." He was silent for a long moment, his palms warm and motionless against tissue that had learned to expect his touch. "This is transference," he said finally, his voice careful. "Treatment dependency creates artificial attachment. What you're feeling isn't real. It's a survival response to prolonged proximity therapy." "Then why do your hands shake when you touch me?" Vess countered. "Why do you maintain contact longer than the treatment protocol requires? Why did you look back when you left yesterday?" Elias pulled his hands away, standing with the stiff movements of someone retreating from dangerous territory. "Because I've made this mistake before," he said, and there was something raw in his voice now, stripped of professional distance. "Because proximity therapy creates intimacy that feels real, but isn't. Because when treatment ends and the dependency fades, what's left is two people who were never actually compatible outside of medical necessity." He moved toward the equipment case, packing supplies with unnecessary precision. "I've watched it happen. Helped patients through the withdrawal process when they realized what they thought they felt was just biochemistry and circumstance. I'm not doing that again." "So you've felt this before," Vess said quietly. "With other patients?" Elias's hands stilled on the medical case. "Once. It ended badly." "How badly?" "Badly enough that I refused 19 cases afterward." He closed the case with decisive clicks. "Badly enough that I promised myself I wouldn't let professional boundaries blur again." He looked at her then, and his expression held something that might have been regret, or might have been longing. "You're going to heal, Vess. And when you do, you'll realize that what you feel right now is just your body's response to sustained contact. It'll pass. It always does. And if it doesn't?" Elias didn't answer. Just finished packing his equipment and left with the same careful distance he'd maintained since she'd asked him to stay. But Vess could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he held himself as if wounded, and she understood that whatever he claimed about transference and dependency, he was fighting the same battle she was. The question was, which of them would surrender first? The calcification returned on the 33rd day. Not severely. Just a small patch on Vess's secondary left arm, barely visible on the medical scans. But Elias's expression when he reviewed the imaging held something that looked like fear wrapped in clinical concern. "It's not uncommon," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "Sometimes the immune system needs additional reinforcement. We'll adjust the treatment protocol." But Vess could hear what he wasn't saying. That regression meant extended treatment. More weeks of twice-daily contact. More time before the inevitable separation. She should have felt distress, should have worried about treatment failure, about the possibility of permanent dependency on synthetic antibodies. Instead, she felt something uncomfortably close to relief. Elias increased the treatment frequency to 3 sessions daily, morning, afternoon, evening, each one requiring sustained contact, his hands against her inner thorax for hours at a time. The regression was minor enough that the medical necessity seemed questionable, but neither of them suggested reducing the protocol. They had stopped pretending this was purely clinical. During the afternoon session on the 2nd day of increased treatment, Elias's hands were positioned against the new calcification site when Vess felt his pulse spike against her skin. "Your bioluminescent patterns," he said quietly. "They've been different lately." Vess knew what he meant. Her species' light patterns served as secondary communication, emotional states, social signals, instinctive responses her conscious mind couldn't fully control. And for weeks now, they'd been responding to Elias's proximity with patterns she recognized from her people's bonding protocols. "I can't control them," she said, which was true but also evasion. "I know." His thumbs resumed their habitual small circles against her skin. "I've been reading about your species' attachment behaviors. The patterns you're displaying, they're usually reserved for genetic pairing." "Yes. That's what I was afraid of." But his hands didn't pull away. If anything, his touch became more deliberate, fingers spreading to cover more surface area. "This is exactly the kind of dependency I was trying to avoid." "Then why are you still here?" Vess asked. "The regression is minor. You could reduce treatment frequency. Maintain professional distance." Elias was quiet for a long moment, his hands warm and steady against her exposed tissue. "Because I don't want to," he admitted finally, voice rough. "Because I've been lying to both of us about transference and biochemistry. when the truth is I stopped being able to maintain clinical detachment somewhere around the second week. His fingers pressed slightly harder, not painful but present, undeniable. I keep telling myself it's just proximity, just sustained contact creating false intimacy. But then you extend your hand to comfort me, or your patterns flare when I enter the chamber, or you ask me to stay, and I can't pretend anymore that this is only medical. Vess felt her breathing chambers seize, her entire system responding to his words with intensity that bordered on overwhelming. "So what do we do?" she asked quietly. "I don't know." Elias's hands were shaking slightly now, trembling against her skin. "The ethical protocols are clear. I'm supposed to maintain professional boundaries regardless of personal feelings. Patient welfare takes precedence over everything else. I'm not asking as a patient. I know." His voice carried something that might have been pain. "That's the problem." They stayed pressed close in the filtered chamber light, neither quite willing to break contact, both caught in the impossible space between what they should do and what they wanted. 3 more weeks, Elias said finally. "If the regression stabilizes, then we figure out what this is when treatment isn't mediating every interaction." It was compromise, delay, a decision to not decide, but it was also acknowledgement that whatever existed between them had exceeded the boundaries of medical necessity, and neither of them knew how to navigate what came next. The evening session on the 40th day lasted 6 hours. Not because of medical necessity, the regression had stabilized, the calcification responding well to increased antibody concentration, but because somewhere around hour 2, when Elias's hands were pressed against Vess's inner thorax and her bioluminescent patterns were flaring with unconscious intensity, he'd made a sound that wasn't quite professional. Vess had looked at him, found his expression stripped of careful neutrality, and asked, "What was that?" "Nothing." But his hands had pressed harder against her skin, his breathing had synchronized completely with hers, and the lie was so obvious neither of them bothered to maintain it. Elias. His personal designation felt dangerous in her mouth, an intimacy they'd both been avoiding. He'd closed his eyes, his entire body tense with the effort of maintaining boundaries that had already dissolved weeks ago. "Your patterns," he'd said quietly. "When they flare like that, I can feel the heat through the contact point. It's distracting." Distracting how? In ways I shouldn't be noticing during medical treatment. Vess had felt her system respond to his words, circulation increasing, patterns brightening involuntarily, breathing chambers working harder. Her body communicating what she hadn't found words for. "What if I want you to notice?" she'd asked. Elias had opened his eyes then, meeting her gaze with expression that held everything they'd been carefully not acknowledging. "Then we're both in trouble," he'd said. "Because I've been noticing for weeks." The space between them had compressed to nothing, his hands against her thorax, her patterns flaring bright enough to illuminate both their faces, the steady rhythm of synchronized breathing, the only sound in the chamber. "Tell me to stop," Elias had whispered, his voice rough. "Tell me this is just transference and dependency, and I'll maintain professional distance." "I can't." Vess's own voice had emerged broken. "Because I don't think it is." His hands had moved then, not pulling away but shifting position, one palm sliding higher on her thorax while the other pressed lower, covering more surface area. The touch remained gentle but had lost all pretense of clinical detachment. "This is a terrible idea," he'd said, even as his thumbs traced patterns against her bioluminescent skin. "There are protocols, professional boundaries, ethical guidelines. I don't care. You should, but you don't." It wasn't a question. Elias had been quiet for a long moment, his hands warm and steady and present in ways that felt less like medicine and more like choice. "No," he'd admitted finally, "I don't." They'd stayed like that for hours, not moving toward anything more physical, just maintaining contact that had transformed from necessary to wanted. His hands learning the landscape of her inner thorax with a tension that went beyond medical assessment. Her patterns responding to his touch with intensity that communicated everything words couldn't. When he'd finally pulled away, the loss had felt acute enough that Vess made a sound. Not quite pain, not quite protest, just involuntary acknowledgement of absence. "I should go," Elias had said, but he hadn't moved. "Stay." Not a question this time, a request. "Vess, stay." He had. Not in the examination platform. That would have crossed boundaries even they weren't ready to navigate. But in the chamber, settling into the observation chair where he could still see her, still maintain some form of proximity. They'd talked through the night, about the 19 cases he'd refused and why, about the one case where he'd failed to maintain boundaries and how badly it had ended, about her command career and the decisions that haunted her, about loneliness and dependency and the specific terror of wanting something you weren't sure you deserved. When morning came and Elias had to leave for his scheduled rounds, they'd both understood something had fundamentally changed, that whatever existed between them had moved beyond treatment protocols and into territory neither of them knew how to map. 2 more weeks, he'd said at the chamber door, his expression holding conflict and longing in equal measure. Then we figure this out. Vess had nodded, watching him leave with the understanding that 2 weeks might not be enough time to answer questions they'd only just started asking. The Hegemony's Medical Ethics Board contacted Elias on the 45th day. Vess only learned about it because she'd developed the habit of tracking his emotional states through treatment sessions, could read tension in his hands, frustration in his breathing, distress in the way he held himself. And when he arrived for the morning session, he was barely maintaining composure. "What happened?" she asked before he'd even begun setting up equipment. Elias was quiet for a long moment, organizing medical supplies with unnecessary precision. "Someone reported us," he said finally. "Filed a formal complaint about treatment protocol violations. The Ethics Board wants to review all session recordings, examine contact duration patterns, assess whether the treatment relationship has become compromised." The word hung between them, clinical and cutting. "What does that mean?" Vess asked, though she already knew. "It means they're going to mandate treatment termination, assign you to a different provider, open an investigation into whether I've violated professional boundaries." His hands were shaking as he laid out collection vials, the trembling visible enough that equipment rattled against the metal tray. "Have you?" Vess asked quietly. "Violated boundaries?" Elias looked at her then, his expression stripped of all professional distance. "Yes," he said. "I stopped maintaining appropriate detachment somewhere around the 2nd week. I've been conducting treatment sessions that last longer than medically necessary. I've stayed in your chamber overnight. I've touched you in ways that have nothing to do with antibody synthesis and everything to do with wanting proximity." He moved closer to the examination platform, hands hovering over her thorax without initiating contact. "I've developed attachment that compromises my clinical judgment. That makes me useless as your provider, because I can't maintain objectivity when every decision is filtered through not wanting to lose access to you." Vess felt something crack in her thorax that wasn't physical. "When does the transfer happen?" 3 days. They're sending another provider, someone with appropriate professional boundaries. The bitterness in his voice was audible. 3 days. 72 hours. Then Elias would walk away, and someone else's hands would touch her. Someone else's presence would fill the chamber. Someone else would complete the treatment he'd started. The thought was unbearable. "What if I refuse?" Vess asked. "What if I request continuation of current treatment protocols? They'll override you. Patient requests don't supersede ethics violations." Elias's hands finally made contact with her thorax, his touch carrying desperate precision. "I'm sorry. I should have maintained better boundaries, should have recognized what was happening before it compromised your care." "You didn't compromise anything," Vess said, her voice fierce. "You saved my life. You showed up every day for 6 weeks and touched me with more care than anyone ever has. You stayed when I asked. You noticed when I needed noticing." Her patterns flared bright, illuminating both their faces in the dimmed chamber. "You made me feel less alone than I've felt in years." "That's not violation, that's—" She couldn't finish, didn't have words for what it was. Elias's hands pressed harder against her skin, his breathing ragged. "I know," he whispered. "I know." The morning session lasted 4 hours. Neither of them spoke about it being one of their last. Neither acknowledged the countdown running in both their minds. They just maintained contact, his hands learning her body's landscape with desperate attention, her patterns responding with intensity that bordered on overwhelming. When he finally pulled away, Elias's expression held something that looked like grief. 2 more days, he said. Then someone else takes over. Vess watched him leave, feeling calcification return that had nothing to do with infection, her entire system hardening around the understanding that dependency wasn't just biological. She'd needed his medical expertise, but somewhere along the way she'd started needing him, and in 3 days the hegemony would take that away as efficiently as they'd taken everything else. Vess contacted her former command chain on the 46th day. She'd spent 23 years in the diplomatic corps before disease had forced medical leave, had accumulated enough political capital that certain doors still opened when she made requests, had maintained relationships with personnel who understood that sometimes protocols needed creative interpretation. The response came 6 hours later, a secure communication channel and a single line of text. "What do you need, Commander?" Vess didn't hesitate, typed out her request with the same precision she'd once used for tactical orders. "I need 48 hours without hegemony oversight. No medical monitoring, no ethics board intervention, complete privacy in my quarantine chamber." The reply took longer this time. When it came, it carried a warning. "This will end your medical career. Possibly his too. Are you certain?" Vess looked at her hands, 4 arms moving with flexibility that had seemed impossible 7 weeks ago. Looked at the examination platform where Elias's hands had pressed against her skin hundreds of times. Looked at the observation chair where he'd spent a night talking her through loneliness neither of them could solve. "I'm certain." The authorization came through within the hour. 48 hours of complete privacy, starting immediately. No questions asked, no records kept, no oversight. Vess sent a single message to Elias's personal terminal. "Come to my chamber. We need to talk." He arrived 17 minutes later, moving through the corridors with barely contained urgency. When he entered her chamber, his expression held confusion and concern in equal measure. "What's wrong? Your message sounded—" "We have 48 hours, Vess interrupted. "No monitoring, no oversight, no ethics board intervention." Elias went very still. "How did you— Does it matter?" She moved closer to him, close enough that her bioluminescent patterns illuminated his face. "I'm not letting them reassign my treatment. I'm not letting them take you away before we've had time to figure out what this actually is." "Vess," his voice carried warning. "If we do this, if we use unsupervised time to continue treatment that's already been flagged as inappropriate, it'll confirm every violation they've accused me of. I'll lose my medical authorization. You'll be cited for patient misconduct." "I know." "Then why—" "Because I don't care about their protocols anymore." Vess's voice emerged fiercer than she'd intended. "Because I've spent 6 weeks learning what your hands feel like against my skin, and I'm not ready for that to end. Because dependency and transference and professional boundaries don't change the fact that I want you here." She paused, her entire system trembling with the vulnerability of what she was admitting. "Because I think you want to be here too." Elias's expression shifted, conflict and longing and something that might have been relief all visible in the lines of his face. "Of course I want to be here," he said quietly. "I've wanted to be here since somewhere around week 3, but wanting isn't enough. There are consequences. Then we'll face them." Vess extended her primary hand, palm up, a gesture her species used for invitation. "Together." Elias looked at her offered hand for a long moment. Then, slowly, he placed his palm against hers, skin to skin, no biosafety barriers, no medical necessity mediating the contact. The warmth was staggering. After weeks of gloved treatment sessions and carefully maintained protocols, the direct contact felt almost overwhelming. Vess could feel his pulse through the connection point, could sense the slight trembling in his fingers, could map every callus and scar against her own skin. 48 hours, he said, his voice rough. "And then what?" "I don't know," Vess admitted. "But I know I don't want to spend them pretending this is still clinical." Elias's fingers curled slightly, his grip tightening against her palm. "Neither do I." They spent the first 12 hours talking. Not about treatment protocols or antibody synthesis or medical ethics. About everything else. Childhood memories and career regrets, and the specific loneliness that came from being valuable primarily for what your biology could provide, rather than who you were. Elias told her about the patient he'd failed to maintain boundaries with, a Than navigator who'd needed 8 weeks of proximity therapy and had developed attachment neither of them knew how to navigate. How it had felt like connection until treatment ended, and they'd both realized dependency had masked fundamental incompatibility. How watching her walk away had made him promise never to blur those lines again. "But this doesn't feel like that," he said quietly, his hand still pressed against Vess's palm. With her, the attachment was survival instinct wrapped in proximity. "This feels different." "How?" Vess asked. "I don't know yet. That's what terrifies me." They talked about Vess's command career, about the decisions that had earned her advancement and the ones that haunted her, about watching fleet movements from tactical displays and never seeing the individual lives those movements impacted, about calcifying emotionally long before disease had calcified her body. "I stopped letting people close," she admitted. "It was easier, cleaner. You can't lose what you never allow yourself to have. And now I'm realizing that protection came with costs I didn't calculate." The conversation shifted to smaller things, favorite foods and hated music, and the specific quality of homesickness that came from living in space stations that never felt like home. They learned each other through words instead of touch, through shared vulnerability instead of medical necessity. When exhaustion finally claimed them both, they settled into the observation area, not in compromising proximity, but close enough to maintain awareness of each other's presence. Vess could hear Elias's breathing, could see the rise and fall of his chest in her peripheral vision, could feel the warmth he radiated across the small distance between them. She slept better than she had in months. The second day, they addressed what they'd been avoiding. "I need to examine the regression sites," Elias said over breakfast rations. "Make sure the calcification hasn't advanced during the treatment gap." It was medical necessity, professional responsibility. But when he opened her thorax and pressed his hands against her inner tissue, the contact felt fundamentally different than every previous treatment session. No biosafety barriers, no clinical detachment, just his skin against hers, warm and deliberate and wanted. "The calcification is stable," he said quietly, his fingers tracing the boundaries of healed tissue, "actually regressing faster than projected. Your immune system has fully integrated the antibody synthesis." His hands didn't pull away. "You don't need me anymore, medically." "I know," Vess said, her patterns flaring involuntarily at his touch. "But I don't want to stop touching you." The admission hung between them, dangerous and honest. Vess's secondary hands came up, settling against his shoulders with gentle pressure. "Then don't." The kiss, when it happened, was tentative, an exploration across species boundaries, finding rhythm despite different anatomies. Elias's hands remained pressed against her inner thorax, while Vess's arms wrapped around him, pulling him closer with strength that had finally returned. It was awkward, unpracticed, perfect. They pulled apart, breathing hard, foreheads pressed together in the filtered chamber light. "We can't go back from this," Elias whispered. "I don't want to go back." "The ethics board—" "I don't care about the ethics board." Vess's voice was fierce. "I care about this, about you, about figuring out what we are when medical necessity isn't dictating every interaction." Elias was quiet for a long moment, his hands warm against her skin. "Okay," he said finally. "Okay." The 48 hours ended with the Hegemony Medical Ethics Board unsealing Vess's chamber and finding exactly what they'd expected. Treatment protocols violated, professional boundaries dissolved, patient and provider relationship compromised beyond recovery. Elias lost his medical authorization immediately. Vess was removed from active service pending investigation. Both faced formal hearings, potential sanctions, career consequences that would follow them indefinitely. Neither of them regretted it. The hearings were brutal. Recorded treatment sessions played back with commentary, highlighting every instance of inappropriate contact duration, every moment where clinical detachment had failed, every violation of established protocols. Elias sat through 3 hours of testimony about his professional failures with expression that never quite became defensive. When they asked him if he understood the severity of his violations, he'd simply said, "Yes." When they asked if he would do anything differently, given the chance, he'd looked directly at Vess across the hearing chamber and answered, "No." The board suspended his medical practice for 2 years, barred him from proximity therapy indefinitely, and recommended against renewing his contract with the Hegemony medical system. Vess received formal reprimand, permanent notation in her service record about patient misconduct, and medical discharge with reduced benefits. They walked out of the hearing chamber together, neither quite certain what came next. "I have savings," Elias said in the transit corridor afterward. "Enough for maybe 6 months without work. After that we figure it out," Vess finished. "Together." He looked at her, really looked, without quarantine glass or biosafety equipment or medical necessity mediating the connection. "You understand this might not work," he said quietly. "Outside of treatment protocols and forced proximity, we might realize we were just two lonely people finding comfort in circumstance." "We might," Vess agreed. "Or we might realize that dependency was just the beginning. That what we feel is real despite the circumstances, rather than because of them. And if it's not, then at least we'll know." She extended her hand, palm up, invitation, choice. "At least we gave it a chance outside of medical necessity." Elias placed his hand in hers, fingers interlacing with natural precision. "6 weeks ago, you were dying, and I was the only thing keeping you alive," he said. "Now you're healed and I'm unemployed, and we're both facing consequences that will follow us for years." Yes. Was it worth it? Vess felt her bioluminescent patterns flare bright. Unconscious communication of emotion she didn't try to suppress. "Ask me again in 6 months," she said. "Ask me when we've had time to figure out who we are, when survival isn't forcing proximity." "And if I ask now?" "Now I'd say yes." Her hand tightened against his. "Absolutely yes." They found an apartment in the civilian sector, small quarters with environmental controls that could accommodate both their species' needs. Nothing luxurious, but private. Theirs. The first week was awkward. Learning to share space without medical protocols, structuring their interactions, discovering each other's habits outside of treatment sessions, figuring out what intimacy looked like when it wasn't mediated by necessity. Elias cooked breakfast with ingredients Vess had never tasted. She taught him the bioluminescent patterns her species used for casual communication. They argued about temperature preferences and learned to compromise. They also learned to touch, without medical justification, casual contact that served no purpose except connection. His hand against her shoulder as he passed, her secondary arm wrapped around his waist while they watched station traffic through the viewport. Small gestures that accumulated into familiarity. The nightmares started in the second week, both of them waking from dreams about calcification returning, about treatment sessions that never ended, about dependency becoming inescapable. They'd lie awake in the darkness talking through fears neither had fully acknowledged during treatment. "I keep dreaming you'll wake up and realize this was just transference," Elias admitted one night. "That without medical necessity forcing us together, I'm just the person who touched you while you were vulnerable. I keep dreaming my body will fail again," Vess countered. "That I'll need you medically, and we'll be right back where we started, unable to separate need from want." "What if we never can?" he asked quietly. "What if there's always going to be uncertainty about whether this is real or just elaborate dependency?" Vess was quiet for a long moment, feeling the warmth of his body beside her in the darkness. "Then we live with the uncertainty," she said finally. "We choose each other every day, and trust that choice matters more than perfect certainty." 3 months after the hearings, Elias received a job offer from a civilian medical research facility, xenoimmunology work that didn't involve proximity therapy. The pay was less than half what the hegemony had provided, but it was employment that wouldn't compromise their relationship. He accepted. Vess found consulting work with a private security firm, analyzing tactical scenarios and training new recruits. Not command, but enough to feel useful, enough to rebuild identity beyond the title she'd lost. They settled into routine that felt less like waiting for inevitable collapse and more like actual life. Morning meals together, evenings processing work frustrations, weekends exploring station districts they'd never had time to visit. And slowly, incrementally, they started to believe it might last. 6 months after treatment ended, they were sitting on their small apartment balcony watching cargo ships navigate docking procedures when Elias said, "You asked me to ask again. 6 months." Vess knew immediately what he meant. And? Was it worth it? He looked at her, his expression open in ways it had never been during treatment. The hearings, The career damage, the uncertainty, all of it. Vess thought about calcification spreading through her exoskeleton, about hands pressed against her inner thorax with medical precision that became care, about dependency transforming into choice, about learning someone through touch and proximity and the specific intimacy of sustained attention. She thought about the cost. Careers ended, reputations compromised, futures redirected. About the uncertainty that still remained, about whether what they felt was real or elaborate transference. She thought about mornings where Elias made coffee exactly how she'd learned to like it, about evenings where her bioluminescent patterns flared unconsciously when he entered a room, about the way his hand found hers without conscious thought when they walked together. Yes, she said, her patterns illuminating both their faces in the growing darkness. Absolutely yes. Elias's hand tightened against hers, his pulse steady and warm and unmistakably alive. Good, he said quietly, because I'm not planning on going anywhere. They sat together, watching ships navigate the vast darkness, two people who had found each other in circumstances neither would have chosen, who had survived dependency and violation and consequence to arrive at something that felt increasingly like home. The calcification was gone. The treatment protocols had ended. The medical necessity that forced their proximity had dissolved completely. What remained was choice. Daily, deliberate, uncertain choice. And that, Vess was learning, was worth more than all the clinical certainty in the galaxy.